Picture this: you're having your morning coffee when your phone buzzes with an emergency alert. Ballistic missile threat inbound to Hawaii. Seek immediate shelter. This is not a drill. For 38 minutes in January 2018, that message terrified an entire state. Parents stuffed their children into storm drains. Tourists huddled in hotel bathtubs. Highway traffic came to a complete stop as people abandoned their cars to find concrete shelter. It turned out to be a false alarm. But here's what stayed with me about that day. It wasn't the panic that revealed the truth about North Korea's nuclear threat. It was how quickly that panic felt completely rational. Because while everyone was relieved it was just a mistake, the underlying reality hadn't changed at all. Kim Jong Un still had nuclear weapons. He still had missiles. And America was still very much in range. That false alarm happened 6 years ago. Since then, has North Korea's nuclear program gotten weaker or stronger? Have they built fewer weapons or more? And most importantly, are we more prepared for the real alert, or less? Those 38 minutes in Hawaii might have been practice for something we're not ready to admit, that the North Korean nuclear threat isn't a distant possibility anymore. It's here, it's real, and it's growing while we argue about everything else. So ask yourself this: when the next alert comes, and experts across the political spectrum agree it's a matter of when, not if, will you know what it means? Will you understand what's actually happening? And will you be ready for the world that follows? Welcome to Safety Zone, where we turn the scenarios you hope never happen into knowledge you can actually use. Let's start with facts, not speculation. Because when it comes to nuclear weapons, the difference between what you think you know and what's actually true could be the difference between rational preparation and dangerous assumptions. According to the International Atomic Energy Agency and intelligence assessments from multiple Western governments, North Korea currently possesses between 40 and 50 nuclear warheads. That number has roughly tripled in the last decade. But warheads are just part of the equation. The delivery system matters more. And this is where the real shift has happened while most Americans weren't paying attention. In 2017, North Korea successfully tested the Hwasong-15, an intercontinental ballistic missile with an estimated range of 8,100 miles. Let me put that in perspective. The distance from Pyongyang to Los Angeles is about 5,900 miles. To Chicago? About 6,800 miles. To New York? 6,900 miles. Every major American city is now within theoretical range of North Korean nuclear capability. I say theoretical because there's still debate about accuracy, re-entry vehicle reliability, and whether they can successfully miniaturize warheads for missile delivery. But here's what defense analysts from the RAND Corporation and the Center for Strategic and International Studies agree on. You don't test an ICBM 15 times over 6 years unless you're confident in your technology. The testing has been methodical, progressive, and successful. Each launch has pushed the envelope a little further. Each test has refined the guidance systems a little more. Think about your own learning curve with technology. When you first got a smartphone, you could barely make calls. 5 years later, you were running your entire life through apps. Technical competence builds on itself, and North Korea has had more than 2 decades to perfect nuclear weapons technology with help from Pakistani networks, Russian expertise, and Chinese supply chains. Here's the mini recap because this foundation matters. North Korea isn't a nuclear aspirant anymore. They're a nuclear power. They have the weapons, they have the missiles, and they've demonstrated the capability to potentially reach American soil. The question isn't whether they could strike the United States. The question is what would make them decide to try. Understanding today's North Korean nuclear threat means understanding how 30 years of American policy created the very problem we're now living with. It started in 1994 with the agreed framework under President Clinton. North Korea would freeze its plutonium program in exchange for fuel oil, reactors for civilian use, and a promise to eventually normalize relations. For 8 years, this worked. Nuclear development stopped. International monitors had access. The crisis seemed managed. Then came 2002. President Bush labeled North Korea part of the axis of evil. An intelligence emerged that Pyongyang was secretly enriching uranium, a second path to nuclear weapons that violated the 1994 deal. The framework collapsed. International monitors were expelled, and North Korea withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. What happened next was predictable in hindsight. North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006. The pattern that followed tells us everything about why we're where we are today. Six-party talks would start with great fanfare. North Korea would agree to steps toward denuclearization. Then talks would stall, North Korea would conduct more tests, sanctions would tighten, and the cycle would repeat. 2009, second nuclear test under Obama. 2013, third test. 2016, fourth and fifth tests. 2017, sixth test, this one a hydrogen bomb with an estimated yield 10 times larger than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. Each administration approached the problem differently. Obama tried strategic patience, waiting for North Korea to feel enough pressure to negotiate seriously. Trump tried personal diplomacy, meeting Kim Jong Un 3 times and claiming they fell in love through letters. Biden has returned to a more traditional approach, coordinating with allies while maintaining sanctions. But here's what none of these approaches changed. North Korea's nuclear arsenal kept growing. Under Clinton, they had no confirmed nuclear weapons. Under Bush, they tested their first bomb. Under Obama, they developed missile technology. Under Trump, they achieved intercontinental range. Under Biden, they focused on tactical weapons and submarine-launched capabilities. Notice the pattern? Every American president for the past 30 years has promised to solve the North Korea nuclear problem. Every single one has left office with that problem worse than when they found it. Why does this matter for understanding today's threat? Because it reveals something crucial about North Korean strategic thinking. They've concluded that nuclear weapons are not a bargaining chip to be traded away. They're the ultimate insurance policy for regime survival. Kim Jong Un watched what happened to Libya's Gaddafi, who gave up his nuclear program and was later overthrown with Western support. He watched what happened to Ukraine, which gave up the world's third-largest nuclear arsenal in the 1990s and was later invaded by Russia. The lesson from Pyongyang's perspective is clear. Leaders who give up nuclear weapons don't stay leaders for very long. If you want to understand the North Korean nuclear threat, you have to understand the man who controls it. And Kim Jong Un is not the cartoon villain that late-night comedians make him out to be. He's a rational actor operating within an irrational system, and that makes him more dangerous, not less. Kim was educated in Switzerland, speaks multiple languages, and has demonstrated sophisticated understanding of international relations, domestic politics, and military strategy. When he took power in 2011 at age 27, many Western analysts expected him to liberalize, to be the reformer who would finally bring North Korea into the modern world. Instead, he's been more ruthlessly efficient than his father or grandfather at consolidating power and advancing nuclear capabilities. Why? Because Kim Jong Un learned the fundamental lesson of authoritarian survival. You can't remain in power by being reasonable. You remain in power by being necessary. And nuclear weapons make him very, very necessary. Think about it from his perspective. North Korea has 25 million people and an economy smaller than Vermont's. South Korea has twice the population and an economy 50 times larger. Without nuclear weapons, North Korea is just another failed state that gets ignored until it collapses. With nuclear weapons, North Korea gets meetings with American presidents. It gets aid packages. It gets treated as a serious player on the world stage. Nuclear weapons turn Kim Jong Un from the leader of an irrelevant rogue state into someone who can credibly threaten the American homeland. But here's where the psychology gets dangerous. Kim Jong Un doesn't want to use nuclear weapons. He wants to be in a position where he might use them. The threat is more valuable than the action because the threat keeps him alive while the action would certainly kill him. This creates what experts call the nuclear paradox. The weapons are most useful when they're never used, but they're only credible if everyone believes you might actually use them. So Kim Jong Un has to constantly walk this line. He has to be threatening enough that the world takes him seriously, but not so threatening that someone decides to eliminate him preemptively. He has to be rational enough to negotiate with, but irrational enough that those negotiations matter. This balancing act explains North Korea's behavior patterns. The provocations followed by diplomatic overtures. The missile tests followed by summit meetings. The threats followed by temporary calm. Kim Jong Un isn't trying to start World War III. He's trying to avoid being overthrown. But here's the problem. When someone is trying to appear just crazy enough to be dangerous, sometimes they end up being actually crazy enough to be dangerous. Let's walk through 3 scenarios for how North Korean nuclear weapons could actually threaten American lives. Not Hollywood blockbuster scenarios, but the ones that keep defense planners awake at night. Scenario 1, the accidental war. It starts with a misunderstanding. Maybe North Korea conducts a missile test that goes off course. Maybe an American reconnaissance flight strays into North Korean airspace. Maybe a South Korean military exercise looks more threatening than intended. In normal circumstances, these incidents get resolved through diplomatic channels. But imagine this happens during a period of high tension, maybe after a cyber attack on American infrastructure that gets blamed on North Korea, or after new sanctions that Kim Jong Un decides cross the red line. Instead of de-escalation, both sides start mobilizing. American forces in South Korea go to higher alert levels. North Korea moves missiles to launch positions. Intelligence agencies start seeing what they expect to see instead of what's actually happening. At some point in this spiral, someone makes a decision that can't be taken back. Maybe Kim Jong Un decides that American troop movements mean an invasion is imminent. Maybe an American commander concludes that North Korean missile preparations mean an attack is coming. The first strike could be conventional, North Korean artillery hitting Seoul, or American airstrikes on nuclear facilities. But once shooting starts between nuclear powers, escalation becomes very hard to control. Here's why this scenario is realistic. It doesn't require anyone to be irrational. It just requires normal human beings to make reasonable decisions based on incomplete information under extreme pressure. That's exactly how most wars actually start. Scenario 2, the regime crisis. Kim Jong Un doesn't live in a democracy. He stays in power because enough powerful people in North Korea believe he's their best option for survival. But what happens if that calculation changes? Maybe it's an economic collapse that makes continuing the current system impossible. Maybe it's a military coup attempt that Kim Jong Un survives but barely. Maybe it's a popular uprising that threatens to spread beyond government control. In any of these situations, Kim Jong Un faces a choice: accept the end of his regime, or use the one weapon that might change the game entirely. A nuclear attack on South Korea or Japan wouldn't save Kim Jong Un's government, but it might create enough chaos to give him bargaining leverage. It might force the international community to keep him in power as the only alternative to complete nuclear anarchy on the Korean peninsula. This is what's called the Samson option, bringing down the tempo on everyone if you can't have what you want. It's not rational from our perspective, but it might be rational from the perspective of someone who knows that losing power means death. Scenario 3, the proxy crisis. This one is subtler but potentially more likely. North Korea doesn't launch missiles at the United States directly. Instead, they provide nuclear materials or technology to another actor. Maybe Iran, maybe a terrorist organization, maybe a state we haven't even identified yet as a threat. When that nuclear device goes off in an American city, the question becomes, how do you retaliate against an attack where the origin is unclear and the responsibility is deliberately obscured? North Korea has a long history of arms sales and technology transfers. They've sold missile technology to Iran, Syria, and Pakistan. They've provided conventional weapons to dozens of countries and non-state actors. Why would nuclear technology be different? The beauty of this approach, from Pyongyang's perspective, is plausible deniability. Even if intelligence agencies are 90% certain that North Korean uranium was used in a terrorist nuclear device, is that enough certainty to justify nuclear retaliation against North Korea itself? Here's the mini recap. None of these scenarios require North Korea to be suicidal. They just require the normal human dynamics of fear, miscalculation, and desperation that drive most international crises. The difference is that when one side has nuclear weapons, normal human mistakes have abnormal consequences. Now let's talk about the part that directly affects you. What happens to daily life in America if any of these scenarios unfold? First, the immediate impact. A nuclear detonation anywhere, whether it hits an American city, an allied nation, or even just an unpopulated area as a demonstration, triggers automatic responses that reshape American society overnight. The emergency alert system activates nationwide. Cell towers get overwhelmed as 300 million people try to call loved ones simultaneously. Financial markets shut down automatically. Commercial aviation stops. Major cities implement lockdown procedures that make COVID restrictions look minimal. But that's just day one. The long-term changes cut deeper. Think about what happened after September 11th, when 3,000 Americans died. We created an entirely new federal department. We implemented screening procedures that still exist 20 years later. We launched 2 decades of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. We changed how Americans think about privacy, security, and government power. Now multiply that response by a factor of 10 or 100, because that's the scale difference between a terrorist attack with box cutters and a terrorist attack with nuclear weapons. Here's what defense analysts expect: immediate implementation of martial law in major metropolitan areas, mandatory evacuation zones around potential targets, rationing of food, fuel, and medical supplies, suspension of normal constitutional protections under emergency powers. The economic impact alone would be staggering. According to studies by the Congressional Budget Office, even a limited nuclear exchange would trigger a global recession worse than 2008. Supply chains that depend on just-in-time delivery would collapse. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency could be permanently damaged. But there's something more subtle that might matter more: the psychological impact. Americans have lived for 80 years with the assumption that nuclear war is something that happens somewhere else, to someone else. The continental United States hasn't been attacked by a foreign power since 1812. That sense of invulnerability shapes everything about how we live. It's why Americans are comfortable with global military commitments. It's why we can afford political polarization. It's why we can focus on domestic issues instead of existential threats. A nuclear attack, even a failed nuclear attack, shatters that assumption permanently. It turns America into a country that lives with the daily possibility of annihilation, just like South Korea has for 70 years, just like Israel has since its founding. Ask yourself, are you prepared for an America that has to organize its entire society around the possibility that any morning could bring nuclear destruction? Because that's the America we'd become the moment North Korean nuclear weapons stop being theoretical and start being real. And here's the part that should worry you most. Our current missile defense systems are designed to handle a small number of relatively primitive missiles. They've never been tested against the kind of sophisticated, multi-warhead systems that North Korea is developing. According to the Government Accountability Office, American missile defense has about a 50% success rate under ideal test conditions. What's the success rate going to be when those missiles are real, when they're coming fast, and when failure means American cities disappear? This is not a drill for building a bunker in your backyard. This is practical preparation for a threat that's real, growing, and largely ignored until it's too late. First, information. In a nuclear crisis, the difference between accurate information and rumor can be the difference between life and death. Right now, download the FEMA app on your phone. It provides official emergency alerts even when cell networks are overloaded. Get a battery-powered or hand-crank radio that can receive emergency alert system broadcasts. These systems work independently of the internet and social media. Know what the warning signals mean. A nuclear attack warning gives you about 15 minutes from launch to impact if the missile comes from North Korea. That's enough time to take shelter, but not enough time to figure out what to do. Plan now where you would go in your home, your workplace, your children's schools. The basic rule is simple. Get as much mass between you and the outside as possible. A basement is best. An interior room on the lowest floor is second best. Stay away from windows. If you're caught outside, any substantial building is better than being in the open. Second, supplies. You don't need a year of food storage, but you do need to survive the immediate aftermath when normal services stop working. The federal government recommends 72 hours of water and food as a minimum. I'd suggest a week if you can manage it, because nuclear emergencies last longer than natural disasters. 1 gallon of water per person per day. Non-perishable food that doesn't require cooking. A first aid kit with prescription medications. Flashlights, batteries, and basic tools. Most importantly, cash. Electronic payment systems fail when power grids fail, and power grids are the first thing that stops working after electromagnetic pulse effects. Third, communication plans. Agree with your family on where to meet and how to contact each other if normal communications don't work. Choose someone out of state as a central contact point. Long-distance lines often work when local systems are down. Fourth, potassium iodide. This is the one item that's specifically for nuclear emergencies. It protects your thyroid from radioactive iodine, but only if you take it before or immediately after exposure. The Food and Drug Administration recommends having it on hand if you live within 50 miles of a nuclear power plant, but that guidance was written when the main threat was reactor accidents, not nuclear weapons. Adults need 130 milligrams. Children need less depending on age. It's available without prescription, it's cheap, and it lasts for years if stored properly. Don't take it unless authorities tell you to. It can cause side effects if used unnecessarily. Here's what's more important than any supplies: mental preparation. Most people who survive disasters do so because they made good decisions under pressure, not because they had perfect equipment. Practice thinking through scenarios. What would you do if you got a missile alert while at work? While driving? While your kids were at school? The goal isn't to eliminate fear. Fear keeps you alive. The goal is to eliminate panic. Panic makes people do stupid things like driving toward danger instead of away from it, or using up all their emergency supplies in the first day. And here's the most important thing: community. Individual preparedness only goes so far. The families and neighborhoods that do best in extended emergencies are the ones where people know each other, trust each other, and can work together. Start building those relationships now, before you need them. The North Korean nuclear threat isn't going away. If anything, it's going to get worse before it gets better. Kim Jong Un is 40 years old. He could stay in power for another 40 years. And every year he stays in power is another year of nuclear weapons development. The arsenal will grow. The delivery systems will improve. The threat will become more sophisticated and harder to defend against. Meanwhile, the window for diplomatic solutions is closing. Every successful nuclear test makes Kim Jong Un more confident. Every failed negotiation makes him more convinced that nuclear weapons are his only guarantee of survival. The next American president, whether that's a second Biden term, a Trump return, or someone entirely different, will inherit this problem in a more dangerous form than any previous administration. The tools that didn't work for the last 30 years are unlikely to work for the next 30. That means Americans need to start thinking about the North Korean nuclear threat as a permanent feature of international relations, not a temporary crisis that diplomacy will eventually solve. The question isn't whether North Korea will give up nuclear weapons. They won't. The question is how America learns to live in a world where a hostile state has the capability to destroy American cities and the demonstrated willingness to threaten exactly that. This is the new normal. The question is whether we're ready for it. Here's the bottom line: the North Korean nuclear threat is real, it's growing, and it's not going away. While politicians debate and diplomats negotiate, the fundamental reality keeps getting worse. You can't control Kim Jong Un's decisions. You can't control American foreign policy. But you can control your own level of preparation for a world where nuclear weapons aren't just something that happens in movies. The false alarm in Hawaii lasted 38 minutes. The next alert might not be false. And when it comes, Everything will depend on what you decided to do before you needed to do it. If this analysis helped you understand a threat that's been hiding in plain sight, subscribe to Safety Zone and turn on notifications. Share this video with people who need to hear it. And let me know in the comments, what part of the North Korean nuclear threat concerns you most? Because while we can't eliminate this danger, we can face it with clear eyes and steady hands. And that's exactly what we're going to keep doing, one scenario at a time. Stay safe, stay informed, and stay ready.